Hey everyone, Brian here from All Things Nintendo. I just wanted to give you a heads up that we are also celebrating Black Friday by discounting the first month of any new subscriber by 50%. All you have to do is go to Patreon, and if you've never been a patron of the All Things Nintendo podcast, you can get 50% off your subscription to either the $5 tier or the $10 tier of the All Things Nintendo podcast. The $5 tier gives you early and ad-free episodes, access to the community Discord, and priority for Q&A episodes, while the $10 tier gives you all of that, plus an entire second weekly podcast covering the industry as a whole. That promotion is going to be running from November 27th, 2024 till December 7th, 2024. So if you have been on the fence or at least curious about finding out what is happening over on the All Things Nintendo Patreon page, this is your chance to try it out. Welcome to the All Things Nintendo podcast. I'm Brian Shea, and this is a weekly podcast to discuss all the biggest news and games from the world of Nintendo. It is Thanksgiving week here in the United States, so I am pre-recording this episode, so as such, there won't be any news discussion this time around, but as you know, such that any happens, I will catch us up next week. This week, though, we are going to be celebrating 3 key anniversaries and talking about the best deals on the eShop's Black Friday sale. Joining me for all of that is a freelance writer you've likely read on outlets like NPR, Polygon, Rolling Stone, and, of course, Game Informer. It is Josh Broadwell. Josh, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks, and thank you for inviting me on the show.
Yeah, excited to have you. You did a few fantastic reviews for Game Informer. It was always fun to work with you when you were doing some freelance writing for us. You did our Baldur's Gate 3 review, right?
I did, yes.
Yeah, I remember that was the one that sold me on that game. It sounded amazing. It had a lot of hype, and then you reviewed it for us, and I think you gave like a 9.5 or something, and I was like, oh man, like I think I got to check out this game. I never finished it, but I did put a good 28 or so hours into it, and I wanted to go back ever since, but last year was a crazy year for games, and this year has been a crazy year for life, so it has not happened. It's not been in the cards. But Josh, we have a tradition here on All Things Nintendo. When anybody makes their debut, we get to know them a little bit through the lens of their history with Nintendo. So the first part of the questions that I'm going to ask you is, what is your first Nintendo game? This can be your first memory with Nintendo. This could be the first game you ever played, first game you ever owned. You can choose to interpret this however you want.
Okay, well, I've actually got a bit of a two-part answer to that. So one is a bit more unorthodox than the other. When I was probably about 4 or 5, my brother, who was 4 years older than me, had a Game Boy, original Game Boy, big, gray brick, and I would, like a good sibling, steal it from him from time to time. And so my mom was concerned that I would break it or something, so she got me this little thing. It was like a little piece of plastic. It was with some plexiglass, and in it was like colored water and oils. You could turn it around, and it was Game Boy shaped. And being a trusting toddler, and maybe perhaps not the brightest one, that was my Game Boy. But yeah, when I did finally get my own, the first one was Kirby's Dream Land 2.
It's a good one.
Yeah,
it's a real good one to
one
start
of the
with.
ones that I kept trying to steal from my brother. So when I finally had it my own.
Well, awesome. Yeah, I mean, have you kept up with the Kirby series ever since?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's always been one of my favorites, because I think probably because it was my first memory.
Do you have a favorite Kirby game overall?
I think it's probably, from someone who grew up with the Super Nintendo, is probably a pretty predictable answer, but Superstar.
Superstar is pretty fantastic. Yeah. What did you think about Forgotten Land? That was a pretty big departure from the standard Kirby formula. Like, it's kind of like everybody was like, oh, it's like Mario Odyssey, but Kirby. But I thought it was a lot more like Mario 3D World, but Kirby.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I enjoyed it. It was, I'm always excited when they do something different with it. So like, Star Allies was fine, but I think it was really refreshing to see the different, departure in direction with Forgotten Land.
And as somebody who, grew up with Dreamland and Dreamland 2 specifically, what did you think about Return to Dreamland that we just recently got the remaster of on Switch?
Oh, I loved it. It was great. It's obviously, it shows its age, I guess, but it's so nostalgic that was, it was worth putting up with I guess the older design.
Yeah, and it was nice to return to like that style of Kirby, right? Because they tried. I mean, I guess like Triple Deluxe was pretty like traditional Kirby, and then Robobot was like, hey, let's just give Kirby a mech, and it
Right.
was like a little over the top. So it was nice to see them come back, and obviously they've experimented quite a bit with like Epic Yarn and Rainbow Curse, where they were just trying different mechanics and different art styles. But I truly do think that Kirby is at its best when it's just like a straightforward like platformer with some action built in, like Forgotten Land. Like that's I feel like if they need to innovate the Kirby franchise, that is the direction that they should go because it plays off of what makes that series so cool and what makes that character so cool and expands it out. I mean, that's why Mario 64 was such a big success when it first came out because they didn't try to be like, I mean, I think that they tried maybe a little too much to innovate with like something like Mario Sunshine, but for that first foray into 3D, they weren't like, oh, well, we're gonna like give him a water pack and we're gonna make this a completely different style game. They're like, no, what if we just transposed the core Mario experience into 3D? And I think that when they innovate with Kirby, they should try to kind of keep that same philosophy.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
All right, well, that brings us to the second part of this question, which is what is your favorite Nintendo game of all time?
Oh, that is such a tough one, but I think I'm going to do a bit of recency bias here and say it's Xenoblade Chronicles 3. That one,
Wow, I don't know if
yeah.
we've gotten that one yet.
It's just fantastic. I mean, I think the way that it presents its themes, well, I mean, I guess it sounds a bit cynical, but I really didn't expect it to actually address the themes that it did address or to do it very well. But it's talking about the purpose of life and what you do when you're left behind. Someone else is gone. How do you honor their memory? How do you keep going? And how do you live when you know that your life is coming to an end? It's just it's extremely it's heavy, obviously, and deeper than I think the first two Xenoblade games ever tried to go. And yeah, it just kind of really captivated me.
Now, I know you're a big RPG guy. Like I mentioned at the top, you reviewed Baldur's Gate 3 for us. So obviously, you have to be a big RPG guy to want to play Baldur's Gate 3. If I wanted to get into the Xenoblade franchise, which entry should I start with? I know we got X coming on. I've heard X is kind of separate from like the trilogy, but like where should I start? Because all the Xenoblade games are about, or Xenoblade Chronicle games, I should say, are about to be on Switch by the time X comes out. So which one should I start with?
I think probably either a definitive edition of the first one or three, because even the three kind of, especially with the DLC, it does draw on kind of like overarching plot threads from the first two games. It is kind of a standalone one, and I think the way that it balances the different combat styles from the first two games and just the more kind of confident storytelling, I think it makes it a lot easier to get into. The first one is a little rough. Is the kind of pseudo MMO style combat with hot bars and everything and cooldowns and whatnot. Not quite as engaging over a long period of time, I think, as what Xenoblade 3 does. Two, I like. It's a mess. I like it, but it's a mess.
Yeah, I've heard X is a little divisive. I know there's a lot of people who love that game, but like I remember our staff, the people who played it, were like, "This is by far the worst Xenoblade Chronicles game." Did you play X, or did you kind of skip the Wii U generation overall?
I played a little bit of it, yeah, but it was a lot later after I'd already played the first two games. It was like a pre-owned copy that stopped working, so I didn't even get to finish it.
Oh no.
Um, yeah, so it was. It's big. I think it's too big for. It's a lot bigger than it should be, and I think there's just not a lot of like narrative sinew to tie it all together. So a lot of times you're just kind of wandering. And I mean, it is visually impressive, and especially later when you do get from videos that I've seen at least access to the flying mech things.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think it would be a tough one to start with, just because it does kind of just throw you out there, and that's pretty much it.
Yeah, I've heard great things about three and the series as a whole. I mean, I shouldn't just specifically say three, but three in particular is the one that I've heard fantastic things about. And, everybody has told me I should check it out. It's just always like with what time, right? Like,
Right,
I
exactly.
never have, like, there are so many huge RPGs that came out in 2024 alone, let alone the ones that like Baldur's Gate 3 that I still haven't like played all the way through and need to catch up on. But like, I haven't finished like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. That's one of my favorite games of the year, and I haven't finished it. Same thing for Metaphor ReFantazio. Like, these are just massive games that I have not had a chance to play all the way through, even though I would love to. Like, I finally finished Astrobot. That's how far behind I am. And like, I love Astrobot is in contention for my game of the year, and I finally rolled credits on it the other night. So it's just impossible to keep up right now, especially with how many huge RPGs have come out.
Yeah.
But yeah, all right. Well, before we jump into these anniversaries, just wanted to remind everyone that you can support the All Things Nintendo podcast through various different methods. The best way is through the Patreon page, which offers bonuses like early and ad-free episodes, access to the community Discord, priority for Q&A episodes, and if you come in at the $10 level, you get an entire second weekly podcast called All Things Gamers. You can also show support for the show on tpublic.com, which is my merch store, and my YouTube channel, which you can find at Brian P. Shea. All right, Josh, since we are skipping the news segment this week, the bulk of this episode is going to be focused on those aforementioned 3 big anniversaries from the world of Nintendo. Uh, let's start off with a big one right here. First up, Nintendo DS turned 20 years old last week, and if you listened to the Game Boy history episode I did back in July, you already know the name Satoru Okada. He worked closely with the legendary Gunpei Yokoi on the Game & Watch, Game Boy Color, the original Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, and Game Boy Advance SP. And then around 2002, Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi instructed his team to start working on a new handheld device inspired by an idea that he actually had earlier, which included having 2 separate screens. And Okada, who was actually the one that fought Gunpei Yokoi on the Game Boy, because Gunpei Yokoi, he was this genius inventor. He created all these amazing products for Nintendo. He was the one that created the Game & Watch, and he wanted the Game Boy to kind of be like a premium Game & Watch. He didn't want it to be like cartridges that you can swap out. He wanted it to be like individual games that are like short-term use and like kind of like the Game & Watch, right? Where it's not like these long-term experiences. And Okada fought him on that, and he actually got Hiroshi Yamauchi to overrule Gunpei Yokoi's desire to have these kind of shorter term games as like the impetus of the Game Boy. So Okada won that battle, but he argued with Yamauchi on this one that he said that the 2 screens was a bad idea for the DS. But unlike his argument on the Game Boy, Okada didn't get his way, and Yamauchi overruled him this time, and that was the birth of the Nintendo DS. So Josh, did you ever own a DS?
I did, yes.
Okay.
I would probably have to agree that the 2 screens probably wasn't a great idea.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. I think it wasn't until, honestly, until much later in the DS life cycle, at least from my memories and my perspective, that the touchscreen was really used in an interesting way. Like, 'cause I remember the first one I got for it, because it was for a birthday. I can't believe it was 20 years ago. That's just wrong.
Did you get it right when it came out? Like with this birthday present, was it like
I think it was the
2004?
following year, it was 2005. Yeah.
Okay.
But WarioWare Touched, I remember having a blast with that and thinking it was really cool the way it used the touchscreen. And then it was a long time before there was a game that came out that really felt like it needed the touchscreen. So I think I would have to agree with that as far as the not the best idea. Maybe for a prototype.
Well, so Yamauchi's thinking was that he was actually worried about what he was considering like pretty underwhelming sales for the GameCube. And he wanted to ensure that the next system that they created was a huge success for the sake of the future of Nintendo. And I found a 2004 article on Nintendo World Report, and Yamauchi said, quote, "If the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell." Which I'm like, wow, that's hardcore.
Right, no pressure.
So shortly after development started, Yamauchi actually retired from Nintendo, and Satoru Iwata took over as president of the company, different Satoru. And in 2003, Nintendo announced that it would be releasing a game system in 2004 that was neither a successor to the Game Boy Advance nor the GameCube, and that it would have 2 screens. And then in January 2004, Nintendo announced that it was codenamed the Nintendo DS. and I found a Yahoo Finance news article from the day that it was announced, and it had a quote from Satoru Iwata. He said, "quote We have developed Nintendo DS based upon a completely different concept from existing game devices in order to provide players with a unique entertainment experience for the 21st century." And so the hope here, according to Iwata and previously Yamauchi, was that the DS would put Nintendo back in its previous place where it was kind of leading the way for innovations within the gaming space. And in May 2004, the device was shown for the first time at E3 by brand new Nintendo of America president and now former guest to All Things Nintendo, Reggie Fils-Aimé. And that was also when they announced that the Nintendo DS was the final name of the handheld. And do you remember that press conference?
Very vaguely, mostly from that period, I remember them saying that it would be like a third pillar and that they would continue to support the Game Boy. And because I remember my mom saying they're not going to do that. They never do it. They always end up phasing it out, and then you have to buy the new ones. That's
So
actually what I remember the most, especially because
do
she was
you
right.
do you remember his famous quote, Reggie's famous quote when they came out? Hold on, I'm trying to find it. Where that was because where yeah, that was when he came out and he introduced himself to the public for the first time. And do you remember how he did it, Reggie?
Honestly, no. I want to say I remember seeing something about it later, like just referenced online, but from the time, no, I don't remember that.
It was definitely referenced online a few times. So Nintendo, very clean cut, family oriented company, and Reggie comes out, and his first thing he says is, "My name is Reggie. I'm about kicking ass. I'm about taking names, and we're about making games."
That's right. Yes, I don't know why I thought that was later. Oh, that was for the D. Wow. Okay.
And then they announced the DS during that, or they'd
Right.
already announced it, but they showed it off for the first time, and it was kind of like a clunkier, thicker prototype than what ended up coming to market. They actually,
Right.
after showing it to the press and I guess they got some feedback at that E3, they iterated on it a little bit and made it a little bit sleeker and a little bit more thinner. But you may recall that those first DS models were actually pretty bulky. So
Yes,
it
they were
was
huge.
that was the one that my brother, I didn't have a DS till years later, but my brother had it, like the original DS, and I would play his. He's 7.5 years younger than me, so he was more in the target demographic at that point.
Right.
He's 10 years old, so yeah. He had the DS, and I remember being excited because it had the Game Boy slot.
Hmm.
And I remember being like, man, this thing's pretty bulky. And I actually think I still have his DS because he fell completely out of gaming. And I think I have his DS, and then I also have a DS Lite that I got from a I don't know how I got it. I think I found it one day. It was a weird thing. I found it. It had an old Power Rangers game in it in the Game Boy Advance slot. I don't know. So Iwata had said that the DS was the first step in Nintendo's attempt to expand the gaming population because he felt that the touchscreen method of gameplay would allow more people in the general population to play games. And this was a strategy that was actually carried forward for the next several pieces of hardware that Nintendo would put out, with I think the Wii being probably the biggest success story in that line. But the 3DS and the Wii U were also products of that line of thinking. Did you ever kind of before I brought this up, did you ever trace that lineage to be like, oh, okay, yeah, the Wii was kind of born out of the DS because the line of thinking that they had was these are going to be more approachable ways for people to get into gaming? Or was this kind of the first time you've drawn that connective tissue?
Um, Not so much as far as like an interface approachability connection. No, I hadn't really thought of that until now. But it was more of just a general sort of marketing it to a broader audience, marketing I guess the software to a broader audience. But yeah, but no, not the interface like that.
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of the first time when I was researching for this episode, I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And
Yeah.
it's interesting to see people like Satoru Iwata, one of the most influential people in the history of Nintendo, talking about it back before the Wii was even I mean, I'm sure they were concepting things for the Wii at that point in the R&D department or something,
Right.
but the Wii was just a sparkle in the eye of Satoru Iwata at that point. And it's to have him intentionally say back in like 2003, 2004 that this is going to be like a new initiative for Nintendo to like expand the gaming population through like different means of control. That's really fascinating. And like, that was followed through all the way up through the Wii U with its touchpad and motion controls and, the second screen experience on a console. Like that's really fascinating to kind of look back and be like, oh, this all started 20 years ago.
Right. Yeah, and I think it would be really interesting too to kind of to know what put them on the idea, like as far as because where you've got even now publishers and manufacturers looking for ways to find new audiences, and then what prompted them to think different ways of interfacing. I wonder if it was like people saying that just maybe the Game Boy was too small, or maybe it was too hard to hold, or whatever. That's yeah, I'm really interested in that now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's more information out there. If nothing else, I'd love to, talk to somebody at Nintendo about this.
Right. Yeah, for real.
It would be pretty fascinating to just like trace the lineage and like the influence of the DS and like what they accomplished with that. But the Nintendo DS finally arrived in the US on November 21st, 2004. It's $150 and it sold over 500,000 units in its first week, which was way over the original projection that Nintendo had, which was 300,000. And it sold over 1 million units in its first month. And then I found an article from the Associated Press. Josh, I don't know how old you are, but are you old enough to know what Tickle Me Elmo is?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so for those who are maybe younger listeners to the show, Tickle Me Elmo was a very sought after Christmas gift. It was an Elmo doll that you would press a button on it and it would laugh like you were tickling it. And it was the most sought after toy in that Christmas, so much so that it became branded as like, oh, Tickle Me Elmo. This is the Tickle Me Elmo of this year. Is kind of like the shorthand for like this is the must-have gift, hottest selling gift, hardest to find gift for the Christmas season. The Associated Press branded the Nintendo DS the Tickle Me Elmo of 2004, and less than a year later, Nintendo announced that the DS had sold more than 6.5 million units. And at launch, it had 7 games in the US, including Spider-Man 2, which is based on the Tobey Maguire movie, Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt, Madden NFL 2005, and of course, a DS remake of Super Mario 64 that added Luigi, Yoshi, and Wario as playable characters. The DS continued being a massive success for the next several years, and they put out various iterations of the hardware over those years. And the DS and DS Lite both included the Game Boy Advance cartridge slot for backwards compatibility. And then they later put out the DSi and the DS XL. The DS Lite actually proved to be the biggest seller out of all of these revisions. Josh, this DS Lite raked in nearly 94 million units in sales alone.
Oh, I had no idea.
That's a crazy amount of sales. I mean, I think that's like 3 or 4 times the amount that the Wii U sold in total. And that's just one of the models of the DS line, right? Like, so that's crazy. So
That's staggering. Yeah. Wow.
that bodes pretty well for the DS family of handhelds, which if people have listened to this show before, they know that I've brought this up. That family of handhelds would go on to be the second highest selling game system of all time, with a total of 154 million units sold, which is just 1 million shy of the all-time record held by PS2. And that also means that the DS is the highest selling Nintendo system of all time, with number 2 being the Nintendo Switch, which has actually still to this day been steadily gaining ground and currently sits just 8 million units behind the DS. The Switch is currently at 146 million units compared to the DS's, which was 156 or 154. I'm sorry.
Which is pretty impressive considering there have only been like 3 very minor iterations of the Switch, most of which don't like improve a lot. Whereas at least with the DS Lite, you've got it's a lot smaller. You can get different colors. I think the battery life was better. The DSi, I don't actually know who that was for. It always seemed like an odd prospect. I'm not sure about that one. So that's really impressive as far as like how successful the Switch has been.
Yeah, I mean the Switch has been. I mean they did an amazing job of consolidating the developers and just consolidating the separate audiences of Nintendo, right? Because some
Yeah.
people just love their handhelds, some people love consoles. I'm much more of a console guy myself, so that would explain why I didn't have a DS for quite a while. But it makes sense that it would sell pretty well, especially with when Animal Crossing was blowing up in the early stages of the pandemic. And,
Right.
they've had a ton of other big successes. Like everybody loves Mario Kart. Like I feel like everybody who owns a Switch has Mario Kart. And it's pretty much like a 1 out of 3 attach rate, slightly more than one out of 3 attach rate. Because I think the last numbers were like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe had sold like 58 million copies. It's by far the best selling Switch game of all time, and there's no chance anything catches it.
Right.
But where does the DS rank among your favorite Nintendo systems? Clearly, you and Okada were wrong with saying that the two screens was a mistake, because it ended up being Nintendo's biggest success ever. But where does
I
this
know,
rank
right?
among your favorite Nintendo systems?
It's somewhere in the middle. I mean, I don't know. I mostly this kind of sounds like hater energy, I guess, but it was a lot of my favorite series had my least favorite installments on the DS. Like Phantom Hourglass, I like the idea. I like the experimentation. I got bored with it. Um, Metroid Prime Hunters is actually like really fascinating from a historical and cultural perspective, because it's like Nintendo trying to do a Halo multiplayer kind of thing. But
Mm-hmm.
at the time, it was just kind of like, eh. Like I just played Metroid Fusion for the first time a few years previously, and I wanted more of that. Um, but but I mean, but at the same time, it's like some really fond memories of it as well. Like I think Advance Wars Dual Strike was probably, I played that a ridiculous number of hours. I mean, it was fantastic. Animal Crossing Wild World is pretty close up there. Like the only thing that replacing holidays with some of those was baffling. But aside from that, it's a really mixed. But so definitely somewhere in the middle for me. Not my favorite, but not my least favorite.
Yeah, honestly, it's pretty low on my overall. Like this era of Nintendo is probably among my least favorites.
Yeah,
Like the GameCube, Game Boy Advance, Wii, and DS era is like in terms of both nostalgically, is that a word?
it is now.
And like at the time, like I loved Wii Sports. There's so many games on the Wii that I love, and there's many games on the GameCube that I love. But like when compared to like the SNES, the N64, and the Switch era, like it's nothing compared to those in my eyes anyway. Like I
Yeah,
understand, like I also didn't, these weren't the formative gaming experiences that they were for other people that are younger than me. Like people who are like, 10, 15 years younger than me, the GameCube and the Wii were their games that they grew up with. That was their NES and Super NES for me. So I totally get why somebody would have that fondness. But it's kind of like when somebody's like, "Oh yeah, like Sonic Unleashed, that was the Sonic game that I grew up with," and I'm like, "Oh well, Sonic 3 and Knuckles was the one I grew up with." So
right.
like I
Yeah,
understand why you would have that fondness for it. But yeah, it's honestly pretty low for me. And we're going to get into that when I get to like the near the tail end of the show. We're going to be ranking our favorite DS games. And spoiler alert, I had kind of a difficult time filling this list out. And it's only five entries.
yeah, mine
Um,
too. To be honest.
so in 2011, the DS's successor, the 3DS, arrived. It retained the dual screen and overall form factor of the DS, as well as backwards compatibility with the DS, but it added more processing power, the ability to display games in 3D without the use of glasses, thanks to a stereoscopic 3D top screen. Uh, we're not going to get too much into the 3DS, but how did you view this as kind of like the evolution of what the DS accomplished?
Um, I thought it was actually a bit of a reversal, at least in terms of the target demographic they were trying to reach, because I think, especially in the first year, the 3D aspect kind of seemed more like a gimmick, and most games didn't use it or didn't use it particularly well. And it seemed like they were trying to lean more on their core franchises than they had done in the regular, like in the DS era. So I think that was, yeah, I think that'd be my overall take. Yeah,
I remember it didn't sell particularly well right out of the gate, and they ended up having to do the 3DS ambassador program for people who adopted it early, and then they did a price cut like very, very early on. But like the people who adopted it early got that ambassador program badge, and it gave them like a bunch of like Game Boy Advance games that you couldn't get otherwise. And I don't think they ever put those games on the virtual console like storefront. I think
No.
it was exclusive, which is such a weird thing. It's such a Nintendo thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I don't know, but DS ended up being Nintendo's biggest success story ever in terms of sales. So, you know what? 20-year anniversary. That's a big milestone for that that handheld that ended up, basically setting the course for Nintendo's next 2 decades. So, happy anniversary to the Nintendo DS. Any closing thoughts before we move on to the second anniversary?
Yeah, I think actually just, and it kind of just came to mind just while we were talking, is it's interesting to see how, I mean, you can kind of start to see in the DS era maybe the beginnings of the idea that perhaps Nintendo should combine its development departments instead of focusing on two consoles, because you've got these more ambitious ideas on the Wii, like full Zelda game, and then but you just get a tiny spin-off on the DS, and you don't really have a whole lot of room to explore maybe the way that you would have done like in say Majora's Mask as a spin-off sequel. And I think getting into the 3DS era where most of their big releases run the 3DS instead of the Wii U. So yeah, I would be interested to know one day maybe if that is when they kind of start having the idea that maybe we should just do one system.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that would make sense because a lot of people were kind of turned off by Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks. Meanwhile, the Wii was getting Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword, which both were pretty well received. So
Yeah,
though in hindsight, Phantom Hourglass, we may not think too highly of it today, but it was well received back in the day as well. Like I think I saw like it was getting like eights and nines, so it wasn't like a failure by any stretch. But like
yeah,
at the same time, yeah, it was definitely second rate when compared to like something like Skyward Sword.
right.
But all right, Josh, let's move on to the second anniversary that we are covering on this show. And it's actually kind of a unique one. Usually, when I do anniversaries, we cover platform anniversaries or game anniversaries. But this time, we are going to do a brief rundown of the 10-year history of the Amiibo. Uh, what fondness do you have for the Amiibo? Are you an Amiibo guy?
Well, I mean, I'll be completely honest. When they first came out, I wasn't able to afford many of them. By the time that I was able to, they were already sold out. So I ended up kind of getting like a really scattered collection of Amiibo, like 8 years after the fact, and I don't use them much in the games. I think probably my favorite integration is just in Breath of the Wild, scan one and a bunch of random stuff falls out of the sky,
Yeah.
like, because that's just fun, whether it's useful or not, it's just fun. Mostly it's just as a collector's thing for me, though.
Yeah, that's how my experience has as well. I recently was on the Toadstool Boardroom podcast with Logan J. Plant, who would know from this show a few times in the past a couple of times in the past few months. And they were talking about the 10-year anniversary of the Amiibos as well. And I told this story where it was like, I was like, this is stupid. I'm just going to like, back in 2014 when they were about to come out, I was like, I'm just going to like, if I want a Nintendo figure, I'll just buy like a nicer Nintendo figure. I don't need these little things. And now I look over and I have like 3 shelves full of Amiibos. And what happened was Super Smash Brothers for Wii U was coming out and Nintendo sent me a review copy and they included with it the GameCube controller adapters and a Mario Amiibo. And I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, whatever. And I used it just like in the review process so I could test it out and like, oh, here's what the Amiibo functionality does.
Right.
And then I was like, well, I should probably get the Link Amiibo too, because like it's cool to have like my favorite characters. And then I slowly expanded from there. And now, like, fast forward, like sometimes like, they would send over Amiibos to the Game Informer office and we would have extras and we would be able to divvy out among the staff. So I have like characters I don't even care about, like some of the Animal Crossing villagers. Like not villagers, but like the animals themselves.
Right.
Like I don't really care about them, but I have them. And then like I wanted a lot of the Mario. I have every single Zelda amiibo. So it quickly got out of hand. And I was like, oh, of course I have to have Ryu and Ken and Sephiroth and Cloud. Like can't not
Right.
have
Yeah,
those.
exactly. How could you
Gotta have
not?
Sonic. Okay, and I love Donkey Kong. So like, yeah, let's get Donkey and Diddy Kong. And it quickly got out of hand. I'm looking at my 3 shelves worth. I love Splatoon, so of course I had to have the Inklings and all them.
Naturally.
So yeah. Let's talk about the history here a little bit of this scourge that has taken over my various shelves, even more so than Funko Pops ever threatened to. So off the backs of the Skylanders, which was created by Toys for Bob and Activision, and then also Disney Infinity, which was created by Disney Interactive Studios. Nintendo saw that these were super successful and people were really liking what is known as Toys to Life, and they decided to try their hand at it. And in 2014, Nintendo revealed to its investors that it was working on a line of figures that you could scan to get various interactive elements in these different games using the Wii U's near field communications capabilities, or NFC for short. At E3 2014, Nintendo announced the Amiibo, which would launch alongside Super Smash Bros. For Wii U. And Shigeru Miyamoto announced that going forward, many of the games in development at Nintendo would be using Amiibo in a variety of ways. And his quote was, Nintendo is known as a video game company, but in fact, it is also a toy company, which, if you know your Nintendo history, you know that they started in toys and cards and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, we talked about Gunpei Yokoi earlier, and like, his contributions to the toys department was pretty substantial as well before he made the leap over to creating gaming devices. On November 21st, 2014, we received the first line of Amiibo figures, which included Wave 1 from the Super Smash Bros. Line, and that consisted of Mario, Peach, Yoshi, Donkey Kong, Link, Fox, Samus, Wii Fit Trainer of all characters, Villager, Pikachu, Kirby, and Marth. And then Wave 2 would arrive 1 month later, adding 6 more figures. Wave 3 hit 2 months later with 11 more. And by the end of 2015, we were 7 waves deep with a ton of Amiibos already on the market. And not only that, but some Amiibo had become extremely hard to find. And I distinctly remember the Villager Amiibo from the Super Smash Bros. Line, the Animal Crossing Villager, being extremely hard to find, extremely valuable, all over eBay with like hundreds of dollars for this thing. And in early 2015, they were just like impossible to find on store shelves, and they're fetching hundreds of dollars on these online auction sites. And in a March 2015 investor call, Nintendo President Satoru Iwata said he was actually shocked by the prices he was seeing on these auction sites. And that fervor continued through 2015 to the point that GameStop's website and registers were crashing on pre-order days for Wave 4, and Amazon set aside special time periods and time blocks where people would have to pre-order their Amiibos. And
Oh
as a
man.
result of several hard to find Amiibo figures, importing actually became a pretty big practice, which, hardcore gamers have been importing games for years,
Right.
but now it was becoming more mainstream because people wanted the specific Amiibo figures, and they were easy to find in Japan, but really hard to find over in the US. A lot of those were due to problems that were happening on the docks as well. So, like, it was becoming harder to get their figures into the US in some cases. So the Amiibo figures themselves depict various characters from across series like Smash Brothers, Super Mario, Legend of Zelda, Kirby, and Animal Crossing. And Nintendo also released a line of Amiibo cards for Animal Crossing Happy Home Designer. And those cards, they were just collectible cards, like you open up booster packs essentially. And they provided similar functionality as the Amiibo figures, but without having to manufacture or buy the more than 450 cards that are a part of that series. Good Lord, 450 cards. And they kept releasing those through 2021, by the way. The final Amiibo cards were 2021.
I do remember
And
that.
yeah, I think I have like 3 or 4 of them lying around somewhere. But speaking of that functionality, they did a wide range of things in these games, including new outfits for Mario Kart, saving character configurations in Smash Brothers, rare outfits and items in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, as you had mentioned. And even you could get Zelda items in the Switch version of Skyrim. So
Oh, I'd
overall,
forgotten about that.
yeah, you get the Hylian shield, the Master Sword, Link's
Right.
tunic in Skyrim, which was wild. So there are 45 games across the Wii U, 3DS, and Switch that support a universal Amiibo functionality, and then several others that allowed for select Amiibos to work. So, also adding to the Amiibo weirdness, it's worth noting that the power-up bands at Super Nintendo World, the amusement park, double as Amiibo. And
Do they
If you
really?
count, they do. So I have a Mario and Yoshi power up band, and you can scan those on your Switch or Wii U, and it will double as a Mario or Yoshi amiibo.
Oh, that's wild. Wild to think that that's probably easier to find than the actual Mario and Yoshi amiibo too.
Maybe. I mean, I don't know. If you go to like a Nintendo store, like if you're like me and you happen to find yourself in Japan, you go to the Nintendo store. They had every single amiibo. It was wild to see them all on
Oh
the
wow.
shelf. But if you count, the power up bands plus the amiibo cards and the figures, how many total functional amiibos do you think there are, Josh? Take a
Ooh,
wild guess.
450.
855.
No, that's insane.
There were 450 cards alone.
Man, that is not what I expected. Over 800.
Yeah, I found a Reddit thread where somebody had compiled all the different types of amiibos, like, and yeah, it was insane to see it all listed out. Like, it took like multiple seconds to scroll as fast as I could to the bottom with my mouse.
Wow.
But if you just want to count the figures, there were 234 officially released figures. The most recent amiibo arrived in February of this year. Do you remember what it was?
Was that Sora?
It was
It was.
Sora from
Okay.
Super
Yes.
Smash Brothers, Kingdom Heart protagonist. How many amiibos do you have overall?
Maybe a dozen. I
Okay.
don't know. Yeah, not very many. I've a few that like ones that I really like. Like I did get the Sephiroth one. I think a couple of Zelda ones and the Palamute I found randomly on eBay. It
Oh,
was like, yeah, that was fun. But yeah, that's all I've been able to collect really.
is there a favorite of yours, or is it just kind
I
of
think
like,
probably
I
the
have?
Palamute because it's cute.
That's fair.
Yeah,
Um,
easy to please.
I was looking up like the valuation of some of these figures, and oddly enough, the Box Boy amiibo figure, which I didn't even know existed, is
No,
the most valuable amiibo. It
really.
seems like
Well,
it
yeah.
regularly fetches around $250
Good
on
lord.
eBay, and I think it was because it was a very limited run of
Oh right.
figures. So it's a Kunbi. Is that how you pronounce it? Keen? I don't know what the name of the character is, but yeah, I did not even know that existed. I have the Shovel Knight one, which was actually the first amiibo that was produced by a third party developer. It was licensed by Nintendo, but it was the first one produced not by Nintendo. And I remember I actually met with Yacht Club Games the day they announced it because there was like a Nintendo Direct, and it was during like it was to coincide with like PAX West that year. And I happened to
Mhm.
be at PAX West, and that night I had a demo for whatever the new Shovel Knight thing was, and I was interviewing Yacht Club, and they're like, "Oh, we have the amiibo if you want to see it." So I had to like hold the amiibo of Shovel Knight. I have one as well, but like it was kind of cool in that moment to do that.
Right.
But any closing thoughts on the amiibos before we take our first break?
I think it would be interesting to see on a smaller scale, less like collectible items, more interaction between like maybe that could be something for augmented reality between items like that and games because I think the concept is neat, even if it was used in a really limited way. But yeah, I would actually like to see more of that. Less reliant on buy these before scalpers get them, and more on something easy that people could actually get their hands on. But I think it's a neat idea. It just wasn't really integrated very much.
Are you shocked, like I am, that Nintendo? I feel like any other company, maybe not Nintendo, but any other company, if they had something that was as successful as Amiibos and as sought after as Amiibos, and yes, I pluralize Amiibos. It sounds weird if I'm just like as successful as Amiibo. Um, are you shocked that they never did like a free to play game where you scan your amiibo figure in to play that game and that is just the character that you play? Like I feel like a MOBA or something like that would be so easy to do for like a company and be like, "Oh, well we'll sell like 50 amiibo figures to like the hardcore players who want to play this game and like scan in their favorite character." Like I feel like that's tailor made for a game like this.
Yeah, I agree. I think it runs counter to, at the very least, the public-facing design philosophies that Nintendo promotes. I could see them not doing that because you're promoting competition over fun, and depending on who's able to get their hands on X expensive figure, they're going to have an advantage over someone else. It doesn't really seem like something they would do, but I could definitely see someone else having considered it.
Yeah, I mean, like if Amiibo was owned by like EA or Activision,
Yeah.
you would have every single game would require Amiibo figures.
Yeah, absolutely.
But Josh, we are going to take our first break of this episode, and when we get back, we're going to dig into, in my opinion, the biggest anniversary that happened over the last couple of weeks, Donkey Kong Country. We will be right back. We are back, and although we already covered two pretty big anniversaries in the first segment of this episode, I want to use this main segment to celebrate the 30th anniversary of a game and series that is very near and dear to my heart. It is Donkey Kong Country. Josh, what was your first experience with this franchise?
The first experience I can remember was early 90s on the Super Nintendo. My dad was working night shifts, so my brother and I could only play like this really short window in the evening, like around dinner time, but not too late because then we'd have to go to bed. And I remember like it was this really exciting thing being able to finally play more of Donkey Kong Country. And then, yeah, it was fantastic. It was completely different from other platformers I'd played at the time. It was, more, I guess, more dangerous seeming, more tense than Super Mario World. It was just, yeah, it really stuck in my mind, and I love it.
So I've told the story a billion times about how I use this game among others like Super Mario World and Mario Kart to bond with my father, who had traveled a lot for work. So we would play like 2-player games a lot, and Donkey Kong Country was one of like the most prominent examples of that. So I won't tell that story again because I've told it so many times. But I do remember asking for it for Christmas in Christmas '94, and I was like so excited to get it. And we were moving from Florida to Maryland at the time. We were temporarily living in Florida. It was like 6-month period that my dad had to relocate to work his job. And so we relocated to just outside of Jacksonville, Florida for 6 months during second grade for me. And I remember snooping a little bit as a kid, because that's what you do when it's
Like
getting
you do,
close to
yeah.
Christmas time. If you're a kid listening to this, don't snoop. It's very bad. And going into my parents' closet and looking up at the top and seeing Donkey Kong Country just kind of poking out. And my parents found out that I found that, and they told me that, oh, that's not actually for you. We got that for your uncle, who also like would play video games. And I'm like, oh, okay. And I got really sad. And then I opened it up on Christmas morning, and I was like, oh, it was for me. And I was so excited. And that was also the first time I got to play Madden, because
Oh wow.
alongside getting Donkey Kong Country, we also got Madden 95, I think it was, that year. So it was like kind of a cool year for Super Nintendo gifts. But in order to talk about the history of Donkey Kong Country, you kind of have to transport yourself back to the early 90s to understand the context that Rare was operating in. If you go back a few months and listen to the Console Wars episode of All Things Nintendo that I did with Blake J. Harris, you already know that Sega was taking it to Nintendo at this point in time. Sega was almost as popular, and for a brief period, it was actually outselling the Super Nintendo with its Genesis system. And Nintendo was starting to gear up to create the Nintendo 64, which at that point was codenamed the Ultra 64. And several developers had already started switching their priorities over to that system in a way that I think that we're already starting to see in modern times with Switch to Switch 2. I've talked about how, like, look at the games that we've seen in 2024 from Nintendo. A lot of them are from like not the A team of developers, right? Like the Zelda game that came out wasn't like directed by Hidemaru Fujibayashi and produced by, I mean, I'm sure maybe it was produced by Eiji Aonuma, but it wasn't like this is the Tears of the Kingdom team making the next Zelda game. It was Grezzo, if I'm not mistaken, the team that did the remake of Ocarina of Time for 3DS and like a few of the other like remasters that Zelda franchise has done. And then same thing for like Mario and Luigi Brothership. It was Acquire that put those out. And then like, we've seen a lot of remasters and, Princess Peach Showtime and games like that. So I think that what we can draw from that is that a lot of the A-team developers have switched over to already developing for Switch 2. And during this period, back in 1993, 1994, we were starting to see that where a lot of the bigger name developers were starting to develop for the Ultra 64, as it was codenamed back then. And the one of the A teams that was still working on the SNES was the Mario team with Takashi Tezuka and Shigeru Miyamoto, but they were preoccupied with Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island at the time. So we were kind of in this weird period of the Super Nintendo, and like I said, the Sega was taking it to Nintendo with their marketing, and they were doing a great job, like starting to narrow the sales gap between the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and it was kind of like a pivotal moment for Nintendo. And one of the studios that was already considering looking towards the future at the Ultra 64 was a British development studio called Rare. And Rare had published a ton of games on NES, including the RC Pro-Am, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Snake Rattle and Roll, Battletoads, and a ton others. But their contributions to the SNES were actually pretty subtle. The only one that I could find up to that point was a Battletoads sequel in 1993. And they actually put out, at that point, more games on the Genesis than they had on the Super Nintendo by 1993. So it was an interesting time to see like this longtime Nintendo partner starting to develop more for the Genesis than they were the Super Nintendo. And around that time, according to a 2001 profile by IGN, Rare had bought new Silicon Graphics workstations with the specific purpose of developing 3D games for the Ultra 64, because that the Silicon Graphics workstations were powerful enough and they were designed with 3D visuals and gameplay in mind. And they were super expensive. It was like, I read somewhere that it was like 80,000 pounds, British pounds per workstation.
Wow.
So like, just like, I mean, we're not going to know what it was back then, but like 80,000 pounds would be today about just over $100,000 US. So these were super expensive workstations. So Rare started fiddling with these, and they discovered that these more powerful machines could also be used to create 16-bit games like you would see on the Super Nintendo. So Nintendo was looking for something that they could do to compete with Aladdin on Sega Genesis of all things. And people would pretty much agree that the SNES version is the better version, but the Genesis version of the Aladdin game had better graphics since they used actual Disney animators for the characters and the environments and everything.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it was like if you look at the animations of the Genesis version of Aladdin, it's just an absolutely gorgeous game. So Nintendo saw this and they're like, we need something that is as beautiful, if not more beautiful, than this game. So, according to a 2014 article that I found on Nintendo Life, Howard Lincoln, who was at the time the chairman of Nintendo of America, also, you know, he was instrumental in helping to bring Tetris to the U.S. and bundling it with the Game Boy. So he has a long history as well with making all these huge decisions at Nintendo. Howard Lincoln traveled to England to meet with Rare because he heard about the capabilities of these Silicon Graphics computers, and he saw a prototype of a game that Rare was developing with that new hardware. It was a boxing game called Brute Force, and it impressed Howard Lincoln, but he actually decided to have deeper conversations with Rare to figure out how they could create a better looking game for the SNES. And you know, probably the most beautiful game that the SNES had ever seen was kind of like what they were looking for, because they needed something that could compete with what the Genesis had with Aladdin, which is just the funniest
It
like
is.
high watermark that they were going for. But up to that point, how did you kind of view the Genesis versus SNES kind of console war? Did you see like that Genesis was like making up ground, or did you see it as like it was just kind of like a flash in the pan for Genesis?
I was in first grade at the time. I had no idea what was going on. I was, I played my Mario games. I talked about Pokemon with kids on the playground, and that was about the extent of my knowledge, to be honest. Like, I had cousins who had the Sega, but I, yeah, that was it. Simpler times, you know?
I mean, hey, I mentioned I was in second grade when this was all going down, so I'm only a little bit older than you, I guess. But I kind of viewed it. I was lucky enough to have both consoles, and I told the story about how my parents packed away my Super Nintendo for a few months by accident
Oh no.
while we were in the process of moving. We moved in with my grandparents very briefly, and so they already took me away from all my friends, and then they also took away my game console. So they took me to a BJ's Wholesale and got me the Genesis with Sonic 2 and Echo the Dolphin. But even though I fell head over heels in love with the Sonic franchise through that Genesis console, I still really loved. It felt like Genesis was like, trying to keep up with Nintendo rather than like, really taking the throne. Even though I loved my Genesis a lot, I was probably more of a Sega Genesis kid once that happened. But then, like, once I had both of them, it was like, okay, the quality between these consoles felt pretty noticeable with the SNES. I
Yeah.
definitely remember renting more games for my SNES than I did my Genesis once I had access to both of them.
Yeah, I think I could definitely see that. Like even now with more of the retro Sega games available, you're looking at the lists even on the Switch Online app. It's like, okay, that seems fun. Not something I would have wanted to spend money on at the time. Or if I could rent one game a month or whatever, I probably wouldn't have picked that. But yeah, and I do wonder too. I'll be completely honest. I have very little knowledge of the '90s games landscape. But I do wonder if Nintendo hadn't been in that sort of transitioning period before the Nintendo 64, if Sega would have been able to gain that much ground, or if it was just because here's an opening, let's fill it.
Yeah, I mean they did, and like I said, they did go for the throat with Nintendo, which nobody had ever really done before, which I
Right.
think was pretty brilliant strategy. And then they also got to build off the backs of the Sonic franchise, which was the exact right game for the 1990s, and having like all that attitude, because that was like,
Right. Yeah.
I know
Very 90s.
yeah, exactly, and the marketing matched that. So I found a GamePro article from 1994 that reported that Rare co-founder Tim Stamper actually suggested to Nintendo that they think that they could use pre-rendered graphics similar to what Mortal Kombat did, but for a platforming game. And Nintendo liked the idea so much they gave Rare the Donkey Kong IP, which at the time was pretty much completely inactive for the better part of a decade. And I
Right.
saw speculation that the reason they did this was because they saw it as low risk. Because, like, oh, if they mess this up and like nothing ever comes of it, it's not like we shelved one of our more active franchises. It's not like we gave them Zelda or at the time Metroid was huge, or
Mm-hmm.
even Mario. Like, they didn't give them that, but they gave them a recognizable name for people who had loved games for more than a couple years. So they gave them the Donkey Kong IP, and then in 2018, lead designer Greg Mails actually was tweeting about Donkey Kong Country, and he was talking about when Nintendo came out, and they noted the countryside backdrop of Rare, which the studio at the time was pretty much based in a barn. Like, that's where they were creating these games, out on the British countryside. So Nintendo codenamed the project Country, and that's
Clever.
ultimately Rare took that as a badge of honor and made that the final name for the game, Donkey Kong Country, which
Okay.
is an interesting little tidbit there.
Yeah, that's
And
clever, and it makes sense too because I always wondered if this is a country. I guess the island is a country, island nation. I don't know. I've never really quite connected the dots there. That makes a lot more sense now.
so, according to a 2021 article from Games Radar, which I'm going to reference quite a bit in the subsequent parts of this retrospective, Rare created its biggest team yet, 12 whole people, to work on Donkey Kong Country.
Wow.
And the developers actually went to a zoo to watch how actual gorillas moved. And here's Greg Mails saying, "We did go to the zoo and observe the gorillas, but found that when they did move, it was completely unsuitable for a fast paced video game. So all of the animation had to be done by hand. We went through about 15 different versions of how Donkey Kong could move. Donkey Kong's movement in the final game is based loosely on how a horse moves, but I recall laughing at some of the other animal themed attempts, including a rabbit and a frog."
A
So
frog.
it would be interesting to
Not
see
what
a
I would have
Donkey Kong
expected,
that could move like a frog, but
right?
he did ride a frog in
Yeah, I
that
was
the
gonna say.
final
I guess
game.
they used that after all. See, and that's really interesting too that they wanted to match the level of animation that was in Aladdin because Disney animators had worked on it, and that's how Disney animators used to work, anyways. Was observing animals and seeing how they're basing their drawings on that. That's a really interesting little tie-in.
Yeah, I'm assuming that was part of the influence there. It was like they were like,
Yeah,
okay, well, this is how Disney does it. We're trying to beat Disney right now, which
we'll do the same
God,
thing.
Nintendo versus Disney. What a
Right?
world that was. So Kevin Bayless, you may know this name. He was the lead artist in charge of redesigning Donkey Kong and also creating a companion for him. And his main goal, according to a Retro Gamer article in 2022, was to make him look like a believable ape-like character. So originally the design was blocky and much more muscular, but Nintendo actually saw this and they were like, no, let's go this route. So they faxed over reference material that caused Bayless to adjust the design. And then the final suggestion came from Shigeru Miyamoto, who you may know is also the creator of Donkey Kong, the original games. He suggested giving Donkey Kong a tie. And that was like Miyamoto's big contribution to the design of like modern Donkey Kong. And according to that Games Radar article, Rare was originally going to use Donkey Kong Jr. as a sidekick character who, he had appeared in a Donkey Kong game several years earlier, but they instead decided to create a new character with a different build and different moves at his disposal. So they decided to model this character after a spider monkey, and the original name for the character was Dinky Kong, but they actually ran into legal problems with that name. So they settled on Diddy Kong, which in 2024 brings with it a whole slew of other weird legal associations. I wonder if there's ever any like consideration of changing that name now.
Right.
Like, how would you even do that? He's such like a well-known character.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, because any other time they've replaced Kong characters, it is a totally new character. I don't think you could replace Diddy Kong at this point.
That'd be like replacing Luigi.
I know,
It's
right?
like I just don't see any way that they could do it. I mean, they didn't replace Wario when Elon Musk went on Saturday Night Live dressed as him, so I guess they're not going to replace it for another problematic character. So for the gameplay and level design, Rare referenced Super Mario Brothers 3, actually. Like that was like their big point of reference. And the notion of having two characters, each one with a hit point, was inspired by the Big Mario, Little Mario concept from that series. And Rare included barrels as a core design and gameplay mechanic to pay homage to the original arcade game where Donkey Kong threw barrels down at the player. And I was also reading up on one of their design philosophies. I forget where I was reading this, but Rare wanted to have it so that like a lot of like the timing based mechanics, like the swinging ropes or the like the barrels that you had to like time and like to launch through, could be completed almost instantaneously. Like the first pass, like you jump in a barrel, it goes up, you hit it immediately, and it will let you go, because they wanted, if you were like good enough at the game, it would allow you to like just blast through the level at like super speed basically. And that was an intentional design by them, which I think is a really smart approach.
It is. That's brilliant. I mean, and you can, I mean, you can recognize that too sometimes, but you still just have that delay and reflex because you think, oh no, this is awful hazard, and then you still have to wait. And yeah, that's fantastic.
So we've talked about how Nintendo used graphing paper to design their Mario levels, and we've even seen that come to fruition with Super Mario Maker, where it's like you basically have like a grid, and they would draw individual squares to design the levels. I read a 2010 article from Edge magazine, and I saw that the team behind Donkey Kong Country used Post-it notes to design the levels. And what they would do is they would take these Post-it notes, and they would like draw like a barrel on it, or they would put like the ropes, and then they would take them and arrange them however they wanted across like a board, and that would allow them to lay out the levels in like more efficient manner rather than having to redraw it every single time. So they would take them
Oh,
off
that's
one and put
smart.
it on the other, and they would copy down like, okay, well we like the way this flow goes, let's take that, put it in the game, and let's start with the next level.
Oh, that's a really clever idea.
Yeah, I really, really thought that was a cool little tidbit that I found in that Edge magazine article. And they also included collectibles like the KONG letters and the balloons to add more depth to the experience, which ended up becoming the studio's trademark with later games like Donkey Kong 64 and
Right.
Banjo-Kazooie, which they coined the term collectathons, or those resulted in the coining of the term. I don't know if Rare in particular coined that term, but they were known as collectathons because there were so many collectibles. They kind of got out of control with them, to be honest.
Yes.
Um, so shortly after development started, Greg Mails and a few other developers traveled to Kyoto to present a prototype to Nintendo, including Shigeru Miyamoto and Gunpei Yokoi. And to that point, Nintendo was concerned that the pre-rendered graphics wouldn't be a good fit for a platforming game and it would actually be unplayable. So the stakes were really high for this visit because they had to prove like this will actually work for a platforming game. So in that Games Radar article, Males recalls that Yokoi actually wasn't a fan of the visuals, saying it looked, quote, too 3D, and which I thought was kind of funny. But
Interesting.
like we've kind of learned that Yokoi was very old school, despite like being the guy that was like a driving force behind the Metroid franchise, and being instrumental in the creation of the Game Boy all the way up through the unfortunately the Virtual Boy. He was very old school in a lot of his designs that he did for Nintendo. So it kind of checks out that he would maybe be like, I don't really like the 3D look of these games. But Miyamoto, who again, the creator of Donkey Kong and also several other of the biggest games of all time, approved of not only the way it looked but the way it played, and he gave them the seal of approval. And even though he was busy with Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island, he still was able to provide a decent amount of input to the Donkey Kong Country team, even though he wasn't the director or producer of the game. And I do want to bring up there's been this long circulated quote that Shigeru Miyamoto said that Donkey Kong Country is proof that as long as a game looks good, it can play terrible and people will still like it. And that has been completely debunked. It is not a real quote. Shigeru Miyamoto actually really likes Donkey Kong Country. So I don't know where this quote comes from. It's one of those weird things where like people love attributing quotes to Shigeru Miyamoto. We don't know if uh, a a rushed game is bad forever, but a delayed game is late once or whatever the quote was, or is eventually good. Like we can't find any attribution to that,
Right.
but we have found that the him dissing Donkey Kong Country and just saying it's nothing but like a good looking game is not ever been said by him, because he's actually a big fan of Donkey Kong Country.
Yeah, that seems like something he would say in private anyways, and not in public.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing to have
Yeah,
that like
I've never
so
heard that before. Wow.
ubiquitously circulated. So in that 2014 article on Nintendo Life that I referenced earlier, it said that Nintendo is usually very protective of its IPs when they license them to other developers, but the Rare co-founders Tim and Chris Stamper actually acted as shields to the development team because they wanted to prevent too much outside influence for Donkey Kong Country. And Males said, quote, Nintendo were extremely busy at the time, so we were left to ourselves. It was an unprecedented thing for them to do, entrusting us with one of their most prominent and fondly remembered IPs with a relatively small and unknown UK development house. I was young and naive enough not to realize just how crucial this game was for Rare. All I wanted to do was create a game that could be remembered. Miyamoto provided us with some suggestions for DK's look, and it was a sketch of his that included the tie. So like that was like the big contribution, it seems like, even though Miyamoto gave them like tips here and there, it didn't seem like even he was all that involved, even though he was, a part of it at least.
That's wild. I mean, I guess like you mentioned earlier that by this point Donkey Kong was inactive for almost a decade. So I guess that kind of just speaks to how relatively unimportant Donkey Kong was to them at the time. Wow.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see that, but like the graphics were really the key selling point of this game. I mean, that's why Howard Lincoln went out to Rare. It's like, hey, like we heard about these Silicon graphics computers that you have. Like, could you make something that could compete with Aladdin? And so Rare actually had to use a special compression technique that let them wring out as much detail as possible from every sprite while not overwhelming the SNES memory. They also had a lot of trouble creating the backdrops for the levels because they were so detailed and also super colorful. And the work was so power intensive that the studio needed to install huge air conditioners so the workstations didn't overheat. And they said
Wow.
that the employees actually suffered in the heat because it was so hot in there, and they had these air conditionings blasting, but it was still extremely hot in there.
Oh wow,
So
that's unbelievable.
yeah.
That's wow.
So the result of using all this power was the pre-rendered graphics that they had aimed to have, and they could display 3D character models on a traditionally 2D system like the SNES. And on the audio side, David Wise was hired as a freelancer to create placeholder music for the game, with the assumption that Nintendo's Koji Kondo would come in later on and create the soundtrack for the final game. And Wise actually looked at the Mario franchise and was like, hey, this is a much more kind of upbeat game, brighter environments and everything. So like the Latin beats that they use in the Mario franchise, I don't think that's a good fit for a game like Donkey Kong Country. I'm going to pull from more 1940s jazz for a lot of the soundtrack. And interestingly enough, to coincide with the anniversary of Donkey Kong Country, just last week, the New York Times did an article talking to David Wise about the soundtrack, and he brought up his favorite track, and also I would argue the most beloved track in the original Donkey Kong Country's soundtrack, Aquatic Ambiance. And he said that that was inspired by a recent breakup that he was going through, which he said made him feel like he was drowning. So he took those feelings and put it towards the water level sound. And that's a really fascinating inspiration to pull. Like, I swear, like just reflecting on that, like these people, like composers and like any artist really, like I swear they speak like a different language than all of like us normal people. Like, how do you take that and make this incredible song like we have with Aquatic Ambiance?
Right, it's one of my favorite things is talking to composers and creators about that, to try and kind of get an understanding of how these things happen.
And it's such a hard thing to pull out of them too, because it's like I said, it's like trying to explain like somebody who only sees in black and white what the color orange looks like. And it's like, how do I even start to do this, because it's a different like language altogether, basically.
Right, and it's one of those things where like if you're trying to explain something, and to you it just seems completely natural, and if you're not really sure, someone's wanting this detailed explanation of how it works, and for you it's just like it just happens.
Yeah.
So
the boss theme, I don't know how much of a rock guy you are, especially 90s rock, but the boss theme in Donkey Kong Country, Wise says, was inspired by Nine Inch Nails' March of the Pigs, which came out earlier in 1994, which, it's a very intense song, very industrial sounding.
Right.
So and a lot of heavy drumming going on in that song. So that was an interesting one as well to pull from that.
Yeah, I did not know that. Wow.
And then according to that same New York Times article, during a demo with Nintendo, Miyamoto was so impressed with the few tracks that were in place when he showed the prototype that he suggested to Rare that they keep David Wise's work in the final game. So Wise went and finished the soundtrack himself, because Shigeru Miyamoto and Nintendo were like, hey, we actually love this soundtrack. We think it fits really well. We don't need to like bring in our own guy to help you out with the music.
Well, that's an incredible confidence boost, especially since he's just a freelancer.
Yeah. That's not a bad deal.
Yeah, right.
So during its final pass on the game, before Rare finalized the title, Nintendo did offer up a few directions to Rare, according to that 1994 GamePro article that I found. And they wanted Rare to reduce the difficulty to make it more widely appealing. Basically, they were saying like, hey, the collectibles and the secrets would provide enough difficulty for the more hardcore players, and then the standard gaming population would be able to just get through the game. That's what they really wanted. And then Miyamoto also suggested adding a ground pound move that Donkey Kong could use to defeat enemies and sometimes find hidden objects in the ground. And it's a different ground pound than what we know with Mario now, where he jumps up in the air and slams his butt down. It's like a ground slap, which is still used to this day in Super Smash Brothers. So those were like the big suggestions. Rare implemented those suggestions and had the game ready by its very tight deadline of Thanksgiving 1994. And by the time development had wrapped up, Rare had put in about 18 months of work involving around 20 total people. But those 18 months were not 18 normal months. They were about 12 to 16 hours a day. And most that ended up spelling the most time the studio had ever put into a game at that point in time. And they were under a lot of pressure to get the game out by Thanksgiving, and they were able to hit that deadline. The game was announced at Consumer Electronics Show in June 1994, and people assumed it was an Ultra 64 game because Nintendo intentionally misled people. They wanted people to be like, oh my God, this is what the future of gaming looks like. This next console looks incredible. And then Nintendo intentionally saved it for the end of the trailer to reveal that it was actually an SNES game, because they
Very
wanted people to
smart.
be like mind blown, like this is actually working on a Super Nintendo. I think that's a really smart tactic.
It is, yeah, definitely. Because it
Especially,
gives you, especially if you've been, I guess, under criticism for maybe not being as advanced as the competition, then not only do you have people waiting for your next big console, you're also showing them, oh, but we're still good enough that we can make our old one look this good too. That's very smart.
and the game was marketed as one of the big pillars in Nintendo's Play It Loud campaign, which was meant to be a campaign that was designed to match the attitude that Sega was bringing with its marketing during that era. And it was very, very 90s, trying so hard to like capture that like Gen X attitude that was happening at the time, and very like neon spray paint and baggy jeans and like dude speak. But Nintendo also sent out VHS tapes to Nintendo Power subscribers called Donkey Kong Country Exposed, which provided behind the scenes looks at Nintendo Treehouse, which we are familiar with today because Nintendo Treehouse does like Treehouse live streams. But this is essentially a group of employees at Nintendo that test games and provide feedback to the developers. And this gave players an unprecedented look at a game straight from Nintendo instead of through a magazine. Josh, do you think that served as kind of a precursor to the Nintendo Direct, or am I just reading way too much into that coming off of our Nintendo DS discussion?
No, I think that's definitely a good way to look at it, because I was just thinking, as you said, it's like, wow, that's about 20 years ahead of current marketing practices now. Skip the middle medium and go straight to the consumer. That's very smart.
It's interesting how they did that. But Donkey Kong Country finally arrived on Super Nintendo on November 21st, 1994. I think all three of the anniversaries have been November 21st, which is very interesting. That was when it hit the US. It received glowing reviews, sold more than 500,000 copies in its first week. In total,
Impressive.
it sold over 9 million copies, making it the third
Wow.
best selling SNES game of all time. Can you guess the two that beat it?
I mean, I'm assuming Super Mario World is up there somewhere.
That's number one.
Can't think of number two.
Super Mario All Stars,
Oh, okay.
which
Well, that makes
is
sense.
the
Yeah.
compilation that remade Mario
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, and then also brought Lost Levels to the US for the first time, the Japanese Super Mario 2. And that placed Donkey Kong Country above huge games like Super Mario Kart, Street Fighter 2, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Metroid,
Yeah.
and
That's a
Super Mario
huge
World 2
achievement.
Yoshi's Island that Miyamoto and Tezuka were working on at the time. So, yeah, big success for Nintendo. And following that success, Nintendo acquired a 25% ownership of Rare, which eventually increased to 49%. And this was the first time Nintendo had ever done this with a non Japanese studio. And using the capital from this minority stake acquisition, Rare moved out of that barn and increased its staff from 84 members to over 250.
Wow.
And Rare released two more Donkey Kong Country games on the SNES. Then on N64, it put out a ton of great games, including GoldenEye 007, Perfect Dark, Banjo Kazooie, Banjo Tooie, Diddy Kong Racing, and Donkey Kong 64, which, by the way, also celebrated its 25th anniversary just last week. So lots of anniversaries that we just don't have time to cover all of them. But Donkey Kong 64, also 25th anniversary. Rare also around this time put out a trilogy of Donkey Kong Land games on the Game Boy. And then they made their GameCube debut with 2002 Star Fox Adventures for the GameCube. So, Josh, out of those post Donkey Kong Country games, what is your favorite Rare game?
I would probably have to say Star Fox Adventures, because that
Really?
is
Okay.
absolutely not what I would have expected from Star Fox. You have animals in space to dinosaurs. It was the coolest thing to me when I first rented it. And I mean, I remember being frustrated with how obtuse it was at times and how easy it was to get lost and stuck. But it just kind of had an atmosphere about it, really, and it was just an unorthodox adventure, and that, like I said, not what I expected from Nintendo, from Star Fox or anything. And it was just a nice change of pace. It was really visually impressive, I think, for at least for an early GameCube game. And it was a different way of interpreting what Star Fox could do and be, which I think they kind of kept a little bit with Star Fox Assault, because you're trying a little bit more of
Hmm.
the land missions and everything. I don't know, but yeah, it just I've got really fond memories of it.
For me, it's Perfect Dark. Or not,
Yeah.
God, what am I saying? Not Perfect Dark. GoldenEye. I got it in my head. I was like, not Perfect Dark. GoldenEye. GoldenEye is by far my favorite Rare game of that era. I really like Banjo Kazooie a lot, but like, I don't know. Diddy Kong Racing is also in contention, but I just have so many fond memories of playing GoldenEye 007 with three of my friends and, you know, going through trying to speed run the levels to unlock all the cheat codes. So much fun. I love GoldenEye, and it's wild to think that like the company that or the studio that put out one of my top three Super Nintendo games also put out one of my top three N64 games, and it's a completely different genre. Like they went from a 2D platformer to a first person shooter. It's like,
Yeah.
what studio does that?
Right. I mean, they pulled it off so well. That's impressive.
So when 2002's Star Fox Adventure for GameCube came out, Rare was really optimistic this was going to be the start of a new prosperous era working with Nintendo. But from various reports that I'm seeing, Nintendo refused to give more resources to Rare, even though GameCube games took a lot more time and money to develop. And Rare's success had also attracted attention from outside companies, and a bidding war actually broke out between Nintendo, Activision, Microsoft, and some other names who all hoped to fully acquire Rare. So Nintendo wanted to up its stake to 100%, and Microsoft and Activision were also interested in that. So later that year, Microsoft was the one that came out on top. You know, they had a lot of money. Microsoft is one of the richest companies on the planet, so it's hard to outbid them. And
Right.
Microsoft acquired Rare in 2002, and the Rare lost access completely to the Donkey Kong IP. And I've seen reports and speculation that Microsoft actually thought it was also acquiring the Donkey Kong IP with
Ooh.
Rare and was kind of surprised when it didn't get Donkey Kong as well, but I can't find any corroboration or proof for that. And I think it would be a little naive of Microsoft with all of its lawyers and like
Yeah.
understanding of how intellectual property works to misunderstand that Nintendo owned the Donkey Kong IP.
Yeah. Even if you have that much money that you can throw around without even thinking about it, you're still going to make sure what you're buying,
Yeah.
presumably, hopefully.
So during that time, Rare was actually developing its next GameCube game. Do you know about this?
I do not.
So they put out Diddy Kong Racing on N64. Their next GameCube game was going to be Donkey Kong Racing for GameCube.
Oh.
And
Oh,
they
that's
actually
sad, actually.
there is a trailer that you can actually find online that was shown, I believe, at E3 of that year, behind closed doors. And that game unfortunately never saw the light of day due to this acquisition. And under Microsoft, Rare has developed Perfect Dark Zero, which was abysmal, the Viva Pinata series, which is a cult classic series, Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which is very different from its original iteration, and several Connect games, which you think of that and you're like, oh, that's sad how they fell, which I agree. But it also did Game Boy Advance ports of Donkey Kong Country Trilogy and a DS version of Diddy Kong Racing. So they weren't completely cut off. They were still open to working on this IP and working with Nintendo properties and Nintendo consoles. But their biggest hit in this Microsoft era has undoubtedly been Sea of Thieves, which is a live service pirate game that launched on Xbox and PC in 2018 and has made massive improvements in the time since its launch. I remember the way that former Game Informer editor Kyle Hilliard described it when he reviewed it was like it's like an ocean, but it's like knee high in depth. But it seems like they have made vast improvements in Sea of Thieves. I've never gotten into it, but it sounds like it would be a fun game if I could get a good group of friends together. But again,
Yeah.
this is Rare just being a completely different type of game, and it is a different group of people at this point. Obviously, like there's the vast majority of the people who were around during the SNES era have departed Rare by this point. But overall, looking at the entire history of Rare, by the way, they also put out Rare Replay, which was a huge compilation of various Rare games from its earlier years. Obviously, they could not do it on the Donkey Kong Country games because, you know, Mike, it was an Xbox published compilation. But do you have a favorite Rare game overall?
I would probably have to say Donkey Kong Country too.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, that's I think a common answer, and
Yeah, I know. Yeah,
it's
not
always going to
exactly
be the
original.
original Donkey Kong for me, just because of nostalgia, and
Yeah.
I just have so many fond memories with that game. Um, the interesting thing here, as I've mentioned several times on this podcast, in 2014, several key members of that like core Rare team that was responsible for games like Donkey Kong Country all the way up through like the N64 era with Banjo-Kazooie, they had all left during the Microsoft era, and they came back together to form an independent studio called Playtonic, and they launched a super successful Kickstarter campaign for a game called Project Yooka-Laylee, and that game ended up being called Yooka-Laylee, Yooka hyphen Laylee, not spelled like the instrument, but it was a spiritual successor to Banjo-Kazooie, which and that game launched in 2017, and then in 2019, that same team released Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair, which is a spiritual successor to Donkey Kong Country, and I personally love Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair. It's a phenomenal 2D platformer. Feels like a modern Donkey Kong Country from the people who made the original games. You know, Grant Kirkhope does the soundtrack. David Wise worked on Yooka-Laylee and the Impossible Lair. So like, it is a lot of the DNA. Kevin Bayliss is the character designer. Uh, uh, yeah, a lot of the old school Rare people are working on these games, so it's really cool to see them still churning out games in these styles of that like people love from 25, 30 years ago. And both of those games are available now to purchase on the Nintendo Switch. And the entire Donkey Kong trilogy from SNES is available through Nintendo Switch Online. Uh, I guess when you look back at the creation of Donkey Kong Country and like kind of this improbable story of Nintendo giving one of its biggest IPs to an outside studio, like how do you rank that in like kind of like the improbable success stories of that era?
I mean, I'd say it's pretty high, especially all the little caveats in it. You know, not only did they give Rare one of its inactive properties, you know, one of the most, even if it was inactive, one of those well-known properties at that point, but they gave them complete freedom to pretty much do whatever with it. You know, Miyamoto's primary contribution was saying, give him a ground pound and give him a tie. You know, that's like that is just an incredible level of freedom to just mold this in whatever way you think is going to resonate with hopefully its original creators and also consumers. I don't know that. I mean, I'm sure there are similar stories. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but yeah, that's just a fantastic story.
So that is going to wrap up our retrospective of Donkey Kong Country. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend you go back and check it out. I think a lot of people will agree with Josh that Donkey Kong Country 2 is kind of the pinnacle of the franchise. But also, like, you know, Retro Studios, the team that is making Metroid Prime 4, they are putting together, or they have Donkey Kong Country. They've done two Donkey Kong Country games themselves. They did Donkey Kong Country Returns, which originally came out on Wii, then was ported to 3DS, and was coming out on Switch next year. And then they did the follow-up Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze, which I would argue rivals 2 as the best Donkey Kong Country game. It's a fantastic game that is already on Switch. So if you want to check out there's 5 mainline console Donkey Kong Country games. 4 of them are already on Switch, and the 5th one is coming out next year. Again, Donkey Kong Country Returns HD, I think it's called. That's coming out early 2025. So go check it out if you haven't played the Donkey Kong Country games. They're all fantastic. In particular, 2 and Tropical Freeze from an objective perspective, and from a nostalgic perspective, I'm always going to recommend the first one. But if nothing else, fire up Nintendo Music and listen to the soundtracks of Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2, because goodness gracious. But we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be doing definitive ranking, getting Josh's eShop Gem of the Week, and recommending some of the sales that you should take a look at on the eShop during its Black Friday sale. We will be right back. We are back, and it's time for Definitive Ranking, a recurring segment where we take a Nintendo topic and give our own personal top 5 lists. Since this episode celebrated, among other things, the anniversary of the Nintendo DS, Josh, I want to get your top 5 Nintendo DS games of all time. So I'll have you start at 5, count it down to 1, and give me a quick sentence or two about each.
All right. For five, I'll go for, and I should just go ahead and say that I'm terrible at ranking things, so I am actually coming up with the order right off the top of my head. For five, we'll say Professor Layton and the Curious Village, a puzzle game where a gentleman detective and his assistant arrive in this village that seems a bit odd, almost as if everyone isn't real. Foreshadowing. And the way they interact with the world and everyone in it is through solving puzzles, random puzzles, logic puzzles. Brilliant game. The whole trilogy is fantastic. For number four, how about Super Mario 64 DS? Mostly for nostalgic reasons. First time I'd ever played it. I skipped in the Nintendo 64 era for PlayStation.
Mm.
Horrible thing to admit on a Nintendo podcast, but it's true. And for three, Animal Crossing Wild World. It was everything that was brilliant about the original Animal Crossing, only easier to play because you could take it with you wherever you wanted to go. Um, Strange choice to remove holidays in favor of things like once every 2 months animals break into your house and demand you pay them compliments. Not sure that was a good idea, but everything else was just fantastic. It was giving you more control, not more control, but more influence over how your town would grow. Just brilliant game. Very fond memories. For two, I'm gonna say Pokemon Black and White 2. Wasn't a fan of the original Black and White. I thought it was a bit constrained feeling for Pokemon. There was less emphasis on exploration, I thought. Black and White 2, I thought was fantastic. Much stronger story, great mix of Pokemon. Um, and yeah, I think my favorite DS game is definitely going to be Advance Wars Dual Strike. I actually think the dual screen implementation was a bit weak because you can't control the battles that are playing out on the top screen, but combining commanding officers, having different synergies between them, so they're different powers depending on who you're working with, and the map design is absolutely fantastic. It was like some of them were almost as if you've got like fan made maps or like some of the arcade maps that were just kind of meant to be ridiculous challenges in the original games, and these were like in the main campaign. So very long sentence for that one, but it still was one sentence.
Well, I can see with like how close you are to the train tracks that Spirit Tracks would not make your list.
No, absolutely not.
No, I live close to train tracks as well, and they love blowing that horn at all hours of the night, and I'm like,
Yes, they
this is not
do.
necessary.
Yep.
But yeah, we actually only have one item that is a crossover here,
Oh,
and again, I mentioned this that I was not a giant DS player, so my list is gonna definitely be like play the hits, but this is like I don't know. This is how I kind of experienced it. I actually was not a fan of Black and White either, so it did not make my list. Even though several people will assert that's one of the best Pokemon games of all time, I just couldn't get into it. So number five for me, Super Mario 64 DS. I think that at the time, it was my like one of my favorite games of all time, right? So like to have a portable version of that was really cool, even if it
right.
didn't control super well because the original DS didn't have a deep or a analog stick or like a nub or anything. It just had the D-pad, which made it really weird to run around in a 3D space with that. But we made it work. Number four for me was Mario Kart DS. I think coming off of Super Circuit, I was just convinced that a Mario Kart game was always going to be bad if it was handheld as opposed to consoles, and Mario Kart DS was fantastic. So it restored my faith in having a portable version of Mario Kart. Number three, because it restored the franchise that I was so in love with as a kid, New Super Mario Brothers. That unfortunately, I think that they kind of ran out of creativity as they got deeper into the New Super Mario Brothers franchise. But that was like a really big deal that they were coming back with the Mario franchise with all new 2D games because it felt like, okay, well, the 3D era is here. That's what all Mario is going to be going forward. So it was really cool to get a new 2D Mario game, and I thought it was it's probably the weakest of the New Super Mario Brother games, but like at the time, it was all I wanted basically.
Right.
Number two, a game you referenced as being very good earlier in the episode, WarioWare Touched. That is, I'm a sucker for the WarioWare games, especially when they thoughtfully implement some of the more like gimmicky, for lack of a better word, controls of some of these Nintendo systems. I think Smooth Moves on Wii is the pinnacle of that, and it's probably my favorite WarioWare game. But like WarioWare Touch does a really great job of using the touchscreen, which didn't feel like we were just shoehorning it in like it kind of did with the Zelda games.
Right.
And then number one for me, it is a remake of what I consider to be the objectively best Pokemon game, and that is Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver.
Yes, really good
Those
choice.
remakes, I would kill to have those on the Switch, even just as is. Just bring them as is, or like make it so that we can control the bottom screen, like by using D-pad and buttons or whatever. I understand like the complications of porting over a DS game to like a single screen system, but like if they could figure out a way to make it work, I don't care. I would pay the full $60 to have that playable on my Switch because
Yeah.
the Heart Gold Soul Silver, fan freaking tastic. Probably the best Pokemon game of all time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And seeing the two regions from the Game Boy Color games,
Oh yeah,
remade in kind of Diamond and Pearl style, just absolutely fantastic.
it was incredible and still mind blowing to this day that they fit the second region into the game on Game Boy Color.
I know, right?
That was not like an exclusive like DS post game thing. Like that was in the original Soul Silver or Pokemon Gold and Silver.
Yeah. Yep, and I know it's off topic a little bit, but I didn't realize at the time when I played the original, Pokemon Silver, that was actually going to happen. So finding out you could travel back there was this whole separate storyline that was mind blowing.
Yeah, so yeah, that's my list, and there's not much crossover, and I think it's more interesting when that happens. So, Josh, that brings us to the eShop Gem of the Week. It's a chance for you to shout out a game that might not otherwise get shine that you can find on the eShop. What is your eShop Gem of the Week?
I am going to go with Strange Horticulture. It's sort of a gothic mystery puzzle game slash shop simulator where you move back to a town where you used to live to run a plant store. Part of it is using your encyclopedia and to know what plants you're selling so you don't sell the wrong thing to the wrong person, which could have horrible results. Keeping a good label system so you can identify based on what people are telling you they want. The people that come into your shop, some of them are normal. They have things like, they need plants for a cold or something. Some of them aren't normal. They come in because they want help. They want your help identifying a plant that was left at the scene of this horrible murder. While you're trying to run your shop, there's this strange cult that's gaining prominence in the town, a bunch of bizarre mysteries going on. You sometimes run into when you're out collecting plants, and then everything kind of gradually starts to converge, and what you're doing ends up directly influencing the outcome of what's going on in the village. Absolutely fantastic piece.
So it's $16, which very affordable. That's what I love about the eShop Gem segment is like a lot of these games are super affordable, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure it'll be on sale at some point. And it came to Switch 2 years ago in 2022. Um, yeah, sounds like a fun game. I've never actually heard of this game before you brought it up to me, so I'll have to check this out and see if it would be up my alley. But I have so many games on my wish list.
Oh yeah.
And as I mentioned, this game probably will go on sale at some point because it's not part of the Black Friday sale that we are going to talk about to close out the show. Because there's sales all the time on the Switch eShop, and I don't cover them very often, but this is a big one. This is the big sale. There's hundreds of games for sale as part of Black Friday. We all know that like Black Friday is like the biggest sales driven shopping period. It used to be one single day, then it became like, oh, I get Black Friday and Cyber
A month.
Monday and Small Business Saturday. Now it's just like, hey, the 2 weeks surrounding Thanksgiving are Black Friday. Like look at Amazon. Like those are all Black Friday deals happening right now, like as we're recording this at the start of the week that this episode is airing. And so I want to take the time to talk a little bit about the eShop gems and maybe some more mainstream games that we would recommend on the Switch eShop as part of Nintendo's digital Black Friday sale on the eShop. I have a few that I've noted here that I'm going to call out, and then I'll throw to you to see if there's anything else you want to shout out. I'm going to go alphabetically. I scrolled and scrolled and scrolled through this sale, and I think I found a good collection of games that I can recommend. Some of them are just absurdly cheap, like less than a drink at Starbucks if you're a coffee drinker. So uh, several of these games are some of the best games on the Switch period. So I'll start off. Ape Out. It is a like kind of like Hotline Miami inspired game where you play as a an ape, and you're escaping from a research facility, and they're the security's trying to shoot you. You have to take them out, and it's all set to like jazz albums that the developer has created, and it is incredible. It's artistic. It's each like world is a different jazz album, and like as you hit the guys, like cymbals will crash. Like so, like you're actually your actions are controlling the music to an extent as well. That's only three
That's
dollars
awesome.
and 74 cents. Um, I'm not going to go into too much detail about all these games. We've talked a lot this episode, but Axiom Verge, outstanding Metroidvania. It's $5. Bad North is a kind of real time tower defense kind of game, a real time defensive strategy game. That's only $3. I've talked endlessly about Balatro. That's on sale for $13.49. One of the best games this year. Final Fantasy X, 10-2 HD remasters on sale for $20. You get two huge beloved RPGs. Golf Story. Speaking of a really good RPG, that is a fun. Don't get Sports Story. Get Golf Story. Sports Story is bad. Golf Story, the game that came out before that from that same studio, is very, very good. One of the best games in the early Switch life cycle. That's only $4. Hyper Light Drifter. If you like top-down Zelda games with kind of like a NES and SNES hybrid aesthetic and an absurd amount of challenge. It's so challenging in certain places, but it's so much fun. I beat it all the way through. It's a great game. That's only $5. Mark of the Ninja Remastered, which is a stealth 2D game that came out. God, that was like Xbox 360 era, but they did a remaster of it. That's only $5. The Messenger, which is the game from the Sea of Stars developer Sabotage, that is $4. That's like a Ninja Gaiden Metroidvania style game, and it has a really cool mechanic where if you travel in like the original era that the game takes place, it's NES graphics, and then when you travel to the future, the game transforms into SNES graphics and changes from like a Ninja Gaiden clone to a Metroidvania. So very cool mechanics to play there. That's only $4. Uh, Persona 4 Golden, one of the best RPGs of its era, $12. Portal Companion Collection, you get two of the greatest puzzle games to ever exist. I don't know how it runs on Switch, but it's only $5. Rogue Legacy 2, it's one of the greatest roguelike games of kind of the modern era, I would say. That's only $12.49. Shovel Knight Treasure Trove, which is an homage back to the 2D NES platforming action games. $20. You get the entire collection of all of the Shovel Knight expansions as part of the Treasure Trove. So that's why I'm calling that out, even though it's $20. Slay the Spire, deck building roguelike, one of the most beloved indie games of the past several years, $8.49. I don't have to tell you why I'm recommending Sonic Mania, one of the best Sonic games of all time, $7.19. I don't know how we got to that number. Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, you get fantastic arcade ports of the early Street Fighter games, $10. Super Mario Maker 2, I will continue to say that one of the great injustices is that Super Mario Maker 2 did not sell well on Switch. I understand the novelty maybe ran out a little bit by the time we got to Mario Maker 2, but it's only $40. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Cowabunga Collection, is $16. That gathers so many of the classic Ninja Turtles games and then some of the non-classic ones as well. If you want to check out some historical Ninja Turtles games, that is there for you for $15.99. Tetris Effect Connected, which Tetris Effect, one of the greatest iterations of Tetris, I would say. Very atmospheric, very cool puzzles, all driven by music, $20. How do you feel about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater? Because Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, HD remakes of the first two Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games, $15.99. And then to wrap it up, Josh, Wargroove,
Ooh,
which is basically Advance Wars, but set in kind of medieval times,
very good choice.
$6. I also didn't mention this because it's a Nintendo discount, but if you've been holding off on Tears of the Kingdom, that is $50 during this sale. So that's a $20 discount. If $70 didn't whet your appetite, maybe $50 will. Josh, did I miss anything? I was pretty comprehensive with my scrolling,
Very comprehensive.
but did I miss anything that you wanted to shout out on this sale?
Yeah, I think like it's more expensive. It's $39.99, but the Crash Bandicoot Crash Anniversary bundle is a
Mm.
pretty good deal because you're getting Crash Bandicoot 4, the remastered trilogy, and the Crash Team Racing remake all
Oh,
together.
wow.
Yeah, it's normally $100, so 39. Is a bit steeper than what you were mentioning, but not a bad deal if you've got it to spend. I can't let this go by without saying you should probably play Final Fantasy IV Pixel Remaster. It's
Mm.
down to 13.49. I know 6 is technically the better game, but for me, Final Fantasy IV is the best. Um, and then if you don't mind long load times, Disco Elysium: The Final Cut is down to 11.99. But the Switch version does have longer load times than you're going to find on PC. And just because Ace Attorney is fantastic, and I think everyone should play Ace Attorney, you could get the Ace Attorney trilogy for $9.99, or the bundle of that and the Apollo Justice collection for $35.99.
Awesome. Well, I mean, I think that we gave the listeners plenty of games to consider.
Quite a few to choose from.
The eShop Black Friday sale, I think it goes through December 3rd, if I'm not mistaken. So,
That is right.
okay.
December 2nd.
I was so close. But yeah, so you have a few days to still consider that as this episode is airing. But Josh, that wraps up this episode of All Things Nintendo. Thank you so much for joining me for this show. It's been great.
Yeah, I had a blast. Thank you very much for inviting me on.
And thank you so much to everyone for listening. As you know, the Patreon and the associated Discord server are the best ways to get any questions or comments in. You can also get in touch with me at brian@allthingsnintendo.com or hit me up on social media at Brian P. Shea. I'm really trying to build up my Blue Sky presence because I'm pretty much leaving Twitter behind, and Threads is kind of not it. So find me on Blue Sky in particular at Brian P. Shea. That is also my YouTube channel name, and if you would subscribe to that channel, it would help me out a lot. Josh, where can people find you online?
I am primarily on Blue Sky now. You can find me at Finn the Brave. That's FIONN, the Brave, all one word. And for as far as like normal work, you can mostly see me on BG247 helping out with guides, and on Sports Illustrated with GLHF.
And that is our show for this week. Thank you again for listening. Take care. We'll see you next time. Before we wrap up this episode of All Things Nintendo, I just want to give a special shout out to the $10 patrons of the podcast: Aaron Smith, Abdullah, Adam Scott, Elena R., Alec Acanino, Alex Stadnick, Andy Junkins, Ben Richland, Chain Whippin, Chaps My Ass, Chris Callie, Colton Bredlau, Dan Norman, Derek Sigmund, Dusty Beeman, Ian T. Clark, Jackal, Jason Thompson, Jawar Hello, Jill Grote, Johnny Five, Jordan Sloat, Jose Villalobos, Joseph Jury, Joshua DeProy, Justin Childress, Cody Gibson, Creeper207, Mad Genie Confused Koala, Marshall Thompson, Megan S., Michael Anderson, Nintendo 101, Paul at Drunk on Mako, Philip Aleva Cox, Pratable, Rob McCann, Bobby Mac 265, Roger Reichart, Russell Sayer, Scott Matthews, Sir Phobos, Smithy Poo, Tux DC, Wham Bam Sam the Gaming Man, Zach Marcus, Zachary Pliggy, Zach Benkel, and Zek Three Sword Sama. Thank you so much for your continued support and for continuing to listen to the All Things Nintendo podcast.